Hi, it's Pastor Andy with Tuesday's video, and a question to begin. Are you a people pleaser? Many people are, and the challenge with being a people pleaser is that it is impossible to please people. It is impossible to please everyone. John Lydgate once said, you can please some of the people all of the time, you can please all of the people some of the time, but you can never please all of the people all of the time. Now, I would add to that, of course, that is true, because you can't even please any one person all of the time. But many try to do so anyway. And they end up not being pleased in themselves. Well, in Romans 15:2, Paul makes an interesting statement that we are to please our neighbor. So does this statement mean that we are to be people pleasers? And if so, what are we to do? Well, as I've said countless times, as many Bible teachers will say all the time, context matters. So I'm not going to overlook Jesus' statement. I'd be a fool to overlook Jesus' statement, so don't hear me doing that. Jesus said that we are to love our neighbor. And when Jesus was asked for clarity, he basically said our neighbor can be anyone. Even a supposed enemy could be considered our neighbor. And I don't have any doubts at all that Paul would have agreed to that, because ultimately everything that Paul has written from Romans 12:9 through 15:7, with maybe the exception of Romans 13:1 through 7, is about loving others, and he has outlined how to do that both for friend and for foe. However, in our verses here in Romans 15, I believe the context centers on the neighbor being a fellow believer. Romans 14:1 through 15:7 is really one unit, and this statement falls within that unit. This is in verse 2. So while we are to love our neighbors in the general sense, all people, the pleasing command, I believe, relates to Christians, and specifically Christians within a specific community of faith. So to please others in this context then is to be for their good and for their edification. And I borrow those 6 words from Tom Schreiner. We are to strengthen them. We are to provide hope for them. We are to welcome them. We are to accept them. And we are to allow them to do the same for us. This idea relates to Romans 14:19 that says we are to pursue peace and mutual upbuilding of one another. So in this case, people-pleasing is not necessarily what makes another person happy. We are to pursue peace. That could make us happy. That's why people-pleasers do what they do oftentimes, is to be at peace with someone. But it is not just about making someone happy. It is to be for their good, and sometimes being for someone's good will not make them happy. Building another person up may not make them happy in the short run. It's better for them in the long run, but they may not see that in the short run. In other words, being a people pleaser in this case, pleasing our neighbor as Paul is writing here, is the idea of being beneficial to the person. Of not necessarily just being beneficial to the person, but doing something that will ultimately lead them to please God and to be pleasing to God. As the preceding verse said, it is about enduring with others and enduring for others as we all wait for the return of Christ, which is our ultimate hope. We have that hope, and as we wait, there will be pressure that comes upon us from the world. And within that pressure, we must learn to bear with others who are going to falter in some ways, knowing that others can then bear with us in the areas where we falter. So my encouragement as we think about pleasing and not pleasing ourselves, as Paul writes at the end of verse 1, but instead pleasing our neighbor, is to take Paul's words seriously, but not in the sense of being what we have labeled a people pleaser, trying to make people happy all the time, but help them to become happy with who they are. not by what you do. And specifically who they are in Christ. Because in doing so, the most important thing that will happen is that we will be pleasing God. And as we help others and please our neighbor in this way, we will help them to learn how to please God as well. As we saw in last week's passage, Romans 14:18, about being acceptable to God, and how that carried back to Romans 12:1 and 2, that we are to be a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, pleasing to God. Being a true people pleaser, a neighbor pleaser, as Paul says, is about helping that person to become someone who is pleasing God. Let us be that kind of a person, pleasing others for the sake of Jesus.